G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Here's a dangerous idea for you. Political violence is intrinsic to the American experience. It is fundamental to American history. It is not something that we should be surprised by. It is something that Americans must live with and perceive as part of the fabric of their nation. That is basically the thesis of Nick Bryant, who is one of the BBC's greatest foreign correspondents. He lived in New York for many years. He lived in Washington. He's lived in South Asia as well. He's written for The Economist, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Sydney Morning Herald, The Age. One of his books is currently in the Oval Office. Joe Biden is a fan. It's called When America Stopped Being Great, A History of the Present. Nick's latest book is called The Forever War and tells the story of America's political polarization over the last 250 years. We wanted to check in with Nick about what he thinks about the current political climate, the current election, and how it fits into the history of American politics. Please enjoy as much as I did. The one and only Nick Bryant. So we were just talking before we started about your ferry rides from Brooklyn, no, not Brooklyn Heights, from Dumbo down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass to the UN. You had an office in the UN?
Yeah, I was working for the BBC in New York at the time, and I had an office there.
What fun. Why were BBC offices at the UN?
Well, we've always had an office at the United Nations. There's a whole kind of 2 stories of press gallery at the United Nations.
Wow.
It's fascinating. So you got the big news organizations like Reuters and the New York Times and AP and all those kind of things, and the BBC's always had a presence there. And we also had an office in Ground Zero, actually, or overlooking Ground Zero, and one of the offices there. That was an extraordinary place to be.
Wow.
As well.
Was it there prior to 9/11, or did you?
No,
we
were very peripatetic, actually. We kept on moving around. We were in Midtown for a while, and then we came downtown and to Lower Manhattan, and yeah, it was a good place to be, actually.
I'll bet.
And surrounded by so much history.
Yeah.
That's what's always struck me about my commute to work. I mean, I would literally cross the water that sort of George Washington staged his escape from the British. And, then you go to Wall Street, which was the site of the Wall Street crash. And Wall Street was also where George Washington was sworn in as president. You had Ground Zero there. You had where 9/11 unfolded. You had the court complex where Donald Trump was arraigned earlier this year. There was so much history.
I always felt, and not just history, I mean, you're talking about, when it comes to things like Donald Trump or 9/11, you're talking about contemporary, it being a contemporary epicenter. I mean, it felt like Rome to me, like at the peak of the empire. It's a place where shit happens. Even when a space shuttle blasts off into orbit, it's happening in the same time zone, at least, if it's going from Cape Canaveral. There was a sense that there was always a sense that...
Well, even crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, the Brooklyn Bridge was kind of seen as the moonshot of the 19th century. It was where America kind of made this statement. We were building bigger bridges than anyone else, in the same way that we could build rockets that got to the moon and got back again. It was seen as a symbol of power.
And the biggest skyscrapers.
Exactly, all that kind of stuff. So, no, I mean, there is so much history packed into that small... and I mean, you think about the things that led to Trump, the 2008 financial crash, that was a Wall Street event. And
even the night of Trump's election, I was in New York and, Hillary gave her concession speech, which wasn't really a concession speech.
Well,
in
she
New
didn't
York,
that night. She did it the next day.
Well, that's right. It was who came out? One of her handlers came out.
Yeah, it was John Podesta, actually.
Yeah,
I was there that night. I mean, they had this amazing setup, if you remember it. They were in this conference center, the Jacob Javits Center, and they'd erected this beautiful stage. It was shaped like America. And it was underneath a glass ceiling. And of course, that was the glass ceiling that figuratively she was supposed to shatter that night. But the night began with a kind of celebratory mood. The Clinton campaign really thought they got it. Then you saw those early results, didn't you, come through from Florida and a couple of other states. Hang on a minute. And then came that sort of shocking news that Trump had won Pennsylvania. And you think, wow, he's won. And everybody in that press room. And I've never known a mood like it, Josh. It was extraordinary. People who are paid to speak for a living, people who are paid to write for a living, I think were absolutely speechless. There was a kind of somber mood. Partly, I think, because we all realised we got it wrong, and if we got it right, we'd have been just a few blocks away at the Hilton where Donald Trump was having his celebration in Midtown. But it was, it's an extraordinary moment.
Yeah, I mean, that was the point that I was making. Both of the speeches were there in New York, so there was a sense of like, it's actually happening here. And Americans often find this funny because they think of their country as new. They think of Europe as old and America as new. My experience coming to New York was that it was ancient in comparison to Australia. That it was the cobblestone streets and like the sense.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's some beautiful sort of architecture, isn't there?
Yeah.
And the building where George Washington was sworn in, it's not even there anymore. I mean, it's that old. It's been torn down and something else has replaced it, which is equally, pretty old, but not as old. Yeah, there's a massive amount of history. The idea that America hasn't got history is just kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, I mean, the point of my book is that they can't escape this history at the moment. There's so much unresolved history.
Yeah. I mean, half a millennium is quite a long time to have been a country, which is basically how long people have been in North America. Europeans have been in North America. Yeah, exactly. Let's just start with Trump then, that Trump election, and we can go back and wiggle around wherever you want to. But did that make you reevaluate things, or did it reaffirm any preconceptions that you had? What did you make of it in the days afterwards, after the shock had subsided?
That's a great question, because I think that Trump's victory in many ways kind of defied our idea of American history, that it was a history of continual progress and advancement. If you've had an African-American president, then you're going to have a female president. That's the next sort of advancement. That's the next act of progress. And of course, Trump made us sort of question, well, maybe we've got history a bit wrong. And this idea that Trump sort of came out of nowhere, I thought was wrong. I thought that he was the beneficiary of all sorts of trend lines that sort of came together in that shock victory. I mean, one of them was an economic trend line. I mean, when Trump said the American dream is dead, that really resonated in the empty factories and the derelict steelworks of the Rust Belt, the seedbed of Trumpism. Nobody really believed anymore that their kids would be better off than they were, which is the essence of the American dream. Racially, I mean, I think we'd like to think that Barack Obama's success was proof that America had sort of absolved the original sin of racism. But Trump made his name as the head of the birther movement. Trump made his name by saying a black presidency is illegitimate. And not all of his supporters liked that, but a lot did. If you look at the culture of the moment, what were we watching from the turn of the century onwards? It was reality TV shows. Who was the star of reality TV? It was Donald Trump. Technologically, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram had put in his hands ways of bypassing the media. But he didn't need to bypass the media because we amplified his message anyway, because there was another kind of post-industrial landscape that he was appealing to, and it was the sort of decimated newsrooms of America. And here came this sort of candidate that was a clickbait candidate to end all clickbait candidates. And when you add all those things together and you introduce the element of the Electoral College, which is this mechanism, obviously, which allows you to win the presidency without winning the nationwide vote, which is what happened with Trump, of course. Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes. You kind of have this historical perfect storm. Although I kind of don't like using the perfect storm analogy, because that suggests the storm will pass. This is America's permanent weather system.
Now?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because he's still viable.
Well, what if in a few months' time he's not?
Well, the fact that he is still viable shows that all of those sort of historical trend lines are still there.
Right.
And I mean, what I'd argue is the historical trend lines go much further back. It's not just a sort of 50-year history of the rise of Trump. It's a 250-year history of the rise of Trump. But even if he loses, he'll lose by a small margin. I mean, I think this was a sort of mistake that some people made in 2020 when he lost. They thought, oh, well, it's the end of Donald Trump. I mean, clearly it wasn't. And clearly all the factors that led to Trump's emergence in 2016 were there to a certain extent in 2020. I mean, if it hadn't been for COVID, I think he would have won the election. And they're there now. I mean, he's still viable as a presidential candidate. He still stands a really strong chance of winning, even after being the architect of January the 6th, even after being an American president who incited a mob to ransack the Capitol in the attempt to overturn an election. All of those problems that led to Trump are still there, and he's still the beneficiary of them. I
mean, I hope that we're talking about just slightly different time frames, because when you ask whether or not this is a storm or whether this is just now the weather or the climate moving forward, I do regard most of the things that you talked about there in terms of the economic disruption of globalization and deindustrialization, the cultural and technological rifts of social media, those things as being like thunderclaps that will at some point have to sort themselves out. Now, a lot hinges on what at some point means, whether that it certainly doesn't mean in 3 years. But I hope that in 30 years that we've figured out how to live with social media algorithms and a globalized economy and artificial intelligence.
I hope so too.
And the deindustrialized manufacturing base.
Yeah.
And we don't just end up with an endless succession of Silvio Berlusconis or worse in our future.
What I'm worried about, Josh, is that, automation was a huge part of this. Trump sort of blamed China. He tried to blame Mexican immigrants. But, the major job losses in the Rust Belt, 75% of the Rust Belt jobs were lost because of automation. And I was always struck by going to the Rust Belt. I spent a lot of time in the Rust Belt in 2016. And I would go and be driven around by Uber drivers sometimes on the way back from the airport who had lost their jobs in the steelworks. So they become Uber drivers, and that was the way they were making their living. But what struck me about Pittsburgh was exactly the place where Uber was actually developing driverless cars. So these poor guys were going to be hit by the next wave. They were going to be hit by the wave of artificial intelligence. And there is this concern that artificial intelligence will do to white-collar jobs what automation did to blue-collar jobs. And, we're going to have to figure out a way of making the economy work for everybody. Because I think political polarization over the last sort of 50 years or so has very much been a product and gone in tandem with income polarization. These more extreme sort of inequalities in wealth between people who are really doing well out this economy and people just aren't doing well at all. And then there's a kind of missing middle. And I think one of the reasons there's a kind of missing middle in politics right now is there's a kind of missing middle in the economy as well. So, hopefully we can figure all this out, but we're kind of not at the moment. There are still those big discrepancies between income, and I think that's what's fueling a lot of this. I mean, there's a huge educational divide, as you know, in America right now. People who are winning in this economy because they're pretty educated, they're computer literate, all that kind of stuff, and a lot of people who, the diploma divide, people who aren't navigating this new economy as well as they navigated the old economy.
Yeah, I mean, Hillary Clinton copped a lot of flack after the election. Do you remember when she gave that speech and she said that like 70 or 80% of the US economy voted for her? Like if you look at the economic output of the country.
Yeah, I mean, the counties that voted for her were the counties that are generating all the wealth now.
Yeah, she won the wealth-producing parts of the country and she won the popular vote.
And if you look at the map, I mean, Trump used to love this map in 2016. He put it up on the wall of the White House. It was like sort of political pornography for him, which showed that America was basically red.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because all the counties, all the rural counties are red.
But nobody lives there.
And then you get these little,
there are 3 cows in the red bits.
And they can't vote at the moment. And then you have these little blue blobs. So these little blue blobs are the ones with all the people in it, right? And they're often the blue blobs that are generating the wealth. And
it's funny you talk about the income inequality and like the divide. I was talking to a libertarian friend of mine recently whom we were getting into an argument about why Australia is comparatively successful just in terms of, it was because he was American and he was visiting Australia and he was like, wow, it's so crime-free and it seems like it's not dirty and it seems like clean and friendly and everyone seems kind of well-informed about things and they know lots about America even and everything. Like it's very middle class. And I was like, we got into an argument about, I was sort of defending the welfare state and defending, the social compact that Australia has that's probably closer to a Western European one than an American one. And he was pushing back on it. And I said, listen, at the end of the day, if you want to have a happy country, you have to pay... how did I put it very politically incorrectly? You have to pay stupid and lazy people lots more money than they're worth. If you want to put it in stark libertarian terms, that's your trade-off. Because if you run a free market and you allow everybody who's going to sink to sink, they're going to shit on the sidewalk. And they're going to occasionally, do stuff that you don't like.
I mean, I think one of the problems of American exceptionalism is this denial that other countries do things better, right? And it's actually sort of meant that America just doesn't sort of embrace ideas from abroad, which will make the situation at home a lot better. And the classic example is obviously of public healthcare. This seen as this kind of European socialized medicine, all this kind of, it's a threat to America. They use an Americanism to sort of go up against Europeanism, which is, our freedom to, be sick basically without adequate
freedom
treatment.
To go bankrupt if we get
exactly.
If
you end up in a kind of ER ward and you haven't got the healthcare. It's. And there's a kind of arrogance attached to this American exception, isn't it? That we're just better, we're just superior, and you don't have to travel far these days to find countries that are doing it much better. In fact, you just cross over the border into Canada, which has got kind of sensible gun laws, far better sort of social welfare net. But America and its idea of an exceptional America sort of stops them embracing ideas which could improve things.
Does it not maybe need to have that myth about itself in order to be the kind of engine of ingenuity and prosperity that it is? You wouldn't want Canada developing all of the world's AI and whiz-bang cancer medications.
Yeah,
you want a country to be shooting for the stars.
Yeah, look, there's bits of American exceptionalism that kind of work for it, and bits that don't, aren't there? And I mean, although I don't, I kind of sort of push back against this idea, and you often hear it from presidential candidates. You hear it from, Kamala Harris at the moment. My story could only happen in America. I'm the daughter of a Jamaican economics professor and an Indian cancer researcher, and here I am running for the presidency. That can only happen in America. Well, that's not true anymore. There's a lot of countries where people are having these stories of extraordinary immigrant success. But yeah, no, I've always been seduced by that idea of the American dream. And I mean, as you say, I mean, it does create this sense of possibility. It does create this great energy. It does create this sense of an animating purpose behind it all. Yeah, I love that. I love that about America. I love that about America. There's good and bad.
There's something about America as an idea, then, maybe not even as a reality. I remember P.J. O'Rourke was asked this question. He opened one of his books, the great, sort of libertarian satirist. He opened one of his books with the line, "Right now is the best time to ever have been alive, and America is the best place to be alive." Something to that effect. And an interviewer said, "That's a bit hubristic, isn't it?" This was an English interviewer, and he rattled off all of these statistics about, Americans don't live as long as these people, Americans have higher inequality, more deaths and so on. And PJ thought for a moment and then he said, "Well, okay, but try changing the sentence and swapping out America for Belgium. Wouldn't everybody laugh just a little if you said, today is the greatest time to be alive, and Belgium is the greatest place to be alive"? There's something about the conceit of America.
And a lot of the countries which are the best places to live haven't got that conceit, and that's maybe why they do so well in a way.
Maybe. I mean, some of them really are nice places to live. Denmark always comes up.
Yeah. Well, Australia. I mean,
Australia.
I always thought, when I first came to Australia, I thought one of the reasons I loved it was because it seemed to be a bit of a mix of Britain and America with editing out the bad bits. So you didn't have the snobbery of Britain. You didn't have the kind of oppressive class system. I know there is a class system in Australia. And it had many things I loved about America without the kind of crazy things like you can buy automatic guns in supermarkets, And I came to realize... Semi-automatic. And I came to realize afterwards, of course, that, Australia was this wonderful amalgam of all sorts of cultures from all over the world and added to the kind of great indigenous tradition as well. So it's this wonderful coming together. But I mean, countries sometimes need to believe in myths. It sustains them. It gets them through difficult times. I think one of the things, though, that Trump showed, especially in 2016, that, like I said, when he said the American dream was dead, I think that really did resonate. A lot of people just could not see how their kids were going to enjoy the same sort of lifestyle, have the same sort of opportunities as they did.
Well, when you say a lot of people, it was a lot of people in those red counties with 3 cows in them that represented the 20% of the economy that didn't vote for Hillary Clinton.
That was a big chunk of it. But even, I mean, we were living in a affluent part of New York City.
We both happened to be living in New York at the same time without knowing each other or knowing of each other. We lived a stone's throw
from each other. We were probably sort of trying to drink the same coffee from the same Australian barista.
This is true. I was
who
in Brooklyn
have colonised the planet, as you know, and colonised strange bits of America. I mean, I remember running into an Australian barista in South Dakota, of all places, and getting a flat white that was delicious. But what struck me was it was not just those kind of blue-collar people who were kind of starting to question the American dream. I think, there were a lot of middle-class people who were struggling to pay for their kids to go to college. And then the kids were going to college and struggling to pay their student debt. There were a lot of kind of middle-class people who didn't have adequate healthcare anymore. And it wasn't just the kind of low-paid jobs in the middle. It was the kind of the well-paid in the bottom strata. It was some of the well-paid jobs in the middle that just didn't exist anymore in the same way that it had in the 70s and the 80s. And I thought that was more, not universal, but certainly more widespread than these sort of pockets in the Rust Belt.
Yeah, but I think they would not diagnose the problem in that Trumpian way of saying the American dream is dead. I think they would say, at least my middle-class friends in New York would say, the American dream is alive and well, but we have these dysfunctional systems that mostly Republicans continue to make ever more dysfunctional and underserviced and underfunded, that should be able to make life easier, that instead are infuriating to deal with.
Yeah, look, American dream is dead. Yeah, I think for some that phrase really did nail it. I think for others maybe the American dream has been deferred.
Yeah, or thwarted.
Or the American dream has become harder to fulfill. Yeah, I think there was a range of kind of American dream kind of problems, starting from the death of it to the kind of, it's really hard now, to some people who were living it. I mean, I was, whenever I was getting depressed about America, I just knock on the door of my neighbors because they had this extraordinary story. Parents, he was Asian American, his parents had come from China. Him and his wife, she'd had a blue-collar background. They set up a .com company that, just did fantastically well around the turn of the century. They had a daughter who was making it as an actress in Hollywood. I mean, they were literally the kind of archetypal American dream family. So it was happening, but it wasn't happening as much as when I first went to America, which was in the mid-'80s. It was just on the eve of the LA Olympics. It was that kind of summertime of American resurgence after Vietnam and Watergate and the Iranian hostage crisis. And it was that summer where Reagan came up with that ringing line, "It's morning again in America." And he won 49 states out of 50 in the election that year, a landslide. It's morning again in America.
That really was the map that Trump thought that he had. The 49 states,
nowhere
1984.
Near. Nobody gets even past, the last one to get 40 was George Herbert Walker Bush. Nobody gets landslides anymore in America. But, for me, it was kind of, okay, it's morning again in America. We've gone from that to American carnage. It's kind of that.
How much of it is it true and how much of it is a narrative? Because, of course, at that time, being openly racist was much more okay, was actually okay in a way that it's completely unacceptable now. Being homophobic was fine. Gay marriage wasn't even a dream. The Rodney King riots.
I'm not here to praise Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan literally launched his 1980 campaign with a dog whistle to the South. He went to this fairground in Mississippi, just down the road from the Mississippi burning killing site where these 3 civil rights workers were killed in the 60s. And he pledged his support for states' rights. Now, states' rights was basically telling the white South that, you can pretty much do what you want on race, without the federal government sort of overbearingly telling you what to do all the time. It was basically a dog whistle. And, he demonized welfare queens. All that kind of stuff. During the AIDS crisis, Reagan was appalling, Reagan had opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was the act that actually ended segregation in the South. So racially, Reagan didn't have... There was a sunny side to Reagan, but there was a dark side of Reagan as well.
It's also worth just remembering that at that time, in 1984, the Civil Rights Act was only 20 years ago, right? It was only... So, the 1960s were as recently as 2009 is to us today.
Yeah, right.
It's amazing to think of how recently that was, that, man had landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in the equivalent of 2009. Yeah, if you were in today's years. In 1984.
And what the civil rights movement did and what the civil rights era did, and, Josh, this, the political geography of America, it totally upended it. Up until that moment, the South had been reliably Democratic. In fact, solidly Democratic. We used to call it the solid Democratic South. And then Lyndon Johnson signs the 1963.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.